Texas, 1945. Captain James Morrison entered the medical barracks at Camp Swift expecting routine examinations. The spring air hung thick with dust and the distant sound of cattle, while 40 German women waited inside, silent as stone, their faces hollow as winter branches. He had examined thousands of prisoners, before soldiers, sailors, airmen, but when the first woman stepped forward and removed her threadbare uniform, Morrison's hands stopped mid-reach. What he saw beneath that fabric would haunt him for the rest of his life and force him to break every regulation in the Army Medical Manual. The war in Europe had ended 3 weeks earlier. Church bells rang across America, ticker tape fell like snow in New York, and soldiers kissed sweethearts in grainy newsreels. But at Camp Swift, 60 miles east of Austin, the war's aftermath had just begun arriving in cattle cars and military transports. The women came from a labor camp near Bremen. They had been captured during the Allied advance through northern Germany, working in factories that produced uniforms, bandages, surgical supplies for the regime's forces. Most were between 18 and 35. Guards called them auxiliary workers. The Geneva Convention called them prisoners of war. Morrison had been a country doctor before the war, treating farmers and ranchers in rural Oklahoma. He knew malnutrition when he saw it. He knew infection, disease, the signs of prolonged suffering. But nothing in his decade of practice had prepared him for what waited inside that barracks. The building itself was standard Army issue. Wooden walls painted white, rows of metal cots with thin mattresses, windows covered with mesh screens to keep out the Texas mosquitoes. The air inside smelled of carbolic soap and something else Morrison could not immediately place, something sharp and wrong that made his stomach tighten. Lieutenant Sarah Chun, the camp's head nurse, stood near the entrance. She had arrived 2 days earlier to help prepare the medical examinations. Her face was pale, her usual professional composure replaced by something Morrison recognized as carefully controlled anger. "Sir," she said quietly, "I think you should know what we're dealing with before you begin." Morrison set down his medical bag. Outside, a guard called out orders in that familiar Texas drawl, all casual authority and easy confidence. Inside, 40 women sat or stood in silence, their eyes tracking every movement with the wariness of animals that had learned to expect pain. "How bad is it?" Morrison asked. Chun handed him a preliminary report. Her handwriting was precise, clinical, but Morrison could read the emotion bleeding through the medical terminology. Severe malnutrition in 37 cases. Advanced tuberculosis in 12. Untreated fractures in 8. Infections that should have been treated weeks earlier, now spreading through tissue and bone. "That's not all," Chun added. Her voice dropped lower. "Sir, 3 of them are pregnant. 2 are in their 3rd trimester. And based on what I've seen, none of them have received any prenatal care whatsoever." Morrison felt something cold settle in his chest. Pregnant prisoners of war. Women who had crossed the Atlantic in cargo ships, been transported in railway cars, marched through processing centers, all while carrying children. The regulations said nothing about this. The Geneva Convention outlined rules for prisoner treatment, but Morrison could not recall a single clause addressing expectant mothers in custody. He looked across the barracks. Some of the women met his gaze. Others stared at the floor or the walls, their faces blank as unmarked paper. They had been told Americans were brutal, that capture meant torture and execution. Propaganda from Berlin had painted vivid pictures of Yankee savagery soldiers who bayoneted prisoners, civilians who spat on the wounded, a nation of merchants and mongrels with no sense of honor or mercy. Instead, they had found cattle ranches and mess halls serving more food than they had seen in years. Morrison picked up his bag and walked to the first cot. The woman sitting there was perhaps 22, with blonde hair cut short and uneven, as if someone had taken shears to it without care or skill. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers interlaced, knuckles white with tension. "My name is Captain Morrison," he said in careful German, the language he had learned from his grandmother back in Oklahoma. "I'm a doctor. I need to examine you to make sure you're healthy. Do you understand?" The woman nodded. Her eyes were blue, ringed with shadows so dark it looked like bruises. Morrison asked her to stand. She did, moving slowly, as if any sudden motion might shatter her like glass. When she removed her uniform jacket, Morrison saw ribs pressing against skin like ladder rungs, collarbones sharp enough to cast shadows. Her arms were covered in old bruises, yellow and green at the edges, fading but still visible. He listened to her heartbeat. Too fast. He checked her breathing. Shallow and labored, with a wet rattle deep in her chest that suggested fluid buildup. He examined her hands and found fingernails split and ragged, the beds underneath stained with chemicals that had burned away the natural pink. "Have you been coughing?" Morrison asked. "Yes," the woman whispered. "For months," Morrison made notes. "Probable tuberculosis, severe malnutrition, chemical exposure consistent with factory work." He moved to the next woman, then the next, and with each examination, the picture grew darker. By noon, Morrison had examined 15 women. The pattern was consistent and damning. All showed signs of prolonged starvation. All had untreated medical conditions that ranged from serious to life-threatening. Several had injuries that had healed incorrectly broken bones that had set at wrong angles, creating permanent deformities. One woman had a compound fracture in her left arm that had somehow mended without surgical intervention, leaving her with limited mobility and constant pain. Morrison stopped at the 20th examination and walked outside. The Texas sun blazed overhead, turning the ground into a shimmer of heat and dust. He stood there for several minutes, breathing deep, trying to steady himself. Chun followed him out. She held 2 cups of coffee, both steaming despite the temperature. She handed one to Morrison without speaking. "They're dying," Morrison said finally. His voice came out rough, barely controlled. "Half of them have tuberculosis. The others are so malnourished, they're at risk of organ failure. And those 3 pregnant women ... He stopped, unable to finish the thought. "I know," Chun replied. "I've already sent word to headquarters. They're bringing in additional medical supplies and staff." Morrison shook his head. "Supplies won't be enough. These women need intensive care. They need proper nutrition, rest, medication that we don't have on hand. Some of them need surgery." He paused, looking back at the barracks. "And those pregnancies are high risk. Without immediate intervention, we could lose the mothers, the babies, or both." The regulations were clear. Prisoners of war received adequate medical care as defined by military standards. Adequate meant treating acute injuries, preventing infectious disease outbreaks, maintaining basic health. It did not mean intensive intervention. It did not mean prioritizing prisoner care over military personnel. It certainly did not mean dedicating limited resources to saving the lives of women who had worked for the regime that started this war. But Morrison had not become a doctor to follow regulations. He had become a doctor because his father died of appendicitis when Morrison was 12, miles from the nearest hospital, too far for help to arrive in time. He had watched his father's face turn gray, listened to his labored breathing, felt utterly powerless as life slipped away in a farmhouse bedroom. He had sworn then never to feel that powerless again. That afternoon, Morrison filed an emergency request with the base commander. He outlined the medical situation in clinical detail, emphasizing the severity of the cases and the potential for multiple fatalities without immediate action. He requested permission to transfer the most critical patients to the base hospital, to allocate additional nursing staff to the barracks, to obtain specialized medications and equipment. The response came back within 2 hours. Request denied. Resources were limited. The war might have ended in Europe, but fighting continued in the Pacific. Medical supplies were earmarked for combat troops, not prisoners. The base hospital had wounded American soldiers requiring care. Morrison was authorized to provide basic treatment within the barracks using available supplies. Nothing more. Morrison read the response 3 times, his jaw tightening with each pass. Then he folded the paper, placed it in his desk drawer, and walked back to the medical barracks. Chun was treating one of the pregnant women when Morrison returned. The woman lay on a cot, her swollen belly visible beneath a thin blanket, her breathing shallow and rapid. Chun had started an intravenous line, pumping precious fluids into veins that looked ready to collapse. "How is she?" Morrison asked. "Preeclampsia," Chun replied without looking up. "Blood pressure is dangerously high. She needs to deliver soon, or we risk losing both her and the baby." Morrison moved to the woman's side. Her name was Margot, according to the intake papers. 24 years old. A seamstress before the war, recruited to work in the textile factories when the regime demanded total mobilization. She had a husband somewhere, captured by Russian forces during the retreat from Poland. She had no way of knowing if he was alive or dead. Margot's eyes opened. They were gray, clouded with pain and exhaustion. She looked at Morrison with an expression he would never forget. Not fear, not anger, but a kind of resigned acceptance that made his throat tighten. "Am I dying?" she asked in broken English. Morrison pulled up a stool and sat beside her cot. He took her hand carefully, mindful of the IV line. Her skin was cold despite the Texas heat. "No," he said firmly. "You're not dying. Not on my watch." That evening, Morrison broke the first regulation. He requisitioned medical supplies marked for military personnel and diverted them to the prisoner barracks. Antibiotics, vitamins, clean linens, proper bandages. He signed requisition forms with creative descriptions that would pass through the supply chain without raising immediate questions. The next morning, he broke the second regulation. He brought in civilian doctors from Austin, colleagues he had trained with before the war, men and women who understood that medical ethics transcended nationality and politics. They came quietly, arriving in unmarked cars, carrying their own equipment, asking no questions about authorization or payment. By the third day, Morrison had transformed the prisoner barracks into a functioning field hospital. He set up sections for different conditions. One area for tuberculosis patients, isolated to prevent spread. Another for general malnutrition cases, with carefully planned feeding schedules to prevent refeeding syndrome. A third for the pregnant women, monitored around the clock for signs of complications. The base commander learned about Morrison's unauthorized activities on the 4th day. He summoned Morrison to his office, a converted warehouse that smelled of cigar smoke and old paper. Colonel Warren sat behind a desk stacked with reports, his face weathered from decades of military service, his eyes hard as flint. "Captain Morrison," Warren began, his voice carrying that particular tone of authority that expected immediate compliance. "You've been operating outside your assigned parameters. You've diverted military supplies, brought in unauthorized personnel, and exceeded your medical authority." He paused, letting the words settle. "Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Morrison stood at attention, his mind racing through possible responses. He could apologize, claim ignorance of regulations, promise to comply with orders going forward. He could protect his career, avoid court-martial, maintain the military discipline that held the entire structure together. Instead, he said, "Sir, with respect, those women are dying. I took an oath to preserve life. That oath doesn't come with footnotes about nationality or prisoner status." Warren leaned back in his chair. For a long moment, he said nothing, simply studying Morrison with an expression that might have been anger or might have been something else entirely. "Do you know what this looks like?" Warren finally asked. "An American officer prioritizing enemy prisoners over his own soldiers?" using military resources to save the lives of women who worked for the regime? The press gets hold of this, Morrison, and you'll be crucified. So will I, so will everyone associated with this camp. Sir, Morrison replied, keeping his voice steady, if the press gets hold of the fact that we let 40 women die in our custody when we had the means to save them, the outrage would be considerably worse. Warren's expression shifted. Something that might have been a smile flickered at the corner of his mouth, gone before Morrison could be certain. It was there. You're a real pain, Morrison, Warren said. But you're not wrong. He pulled out a form and began writing. I'm issuing you authorization for continued medical intervention. You'll report directly to me on all activities. You'll maintain detailed records. And if this blows up in our faces, I'm throwing you under the bus, so fast it'll make your head spin. Understood? Morrison felt tension he had not realized he was carrying drain from his shoulders. Understood, sir. Now get out of here and save some lives. Morrison returned to the barracks and assembled his expanded medical team. 3 civilian doctors, 7 nurses including Chun, and 2 medics who had volunteered their off-duty hours. He briefed them on the cases, assigned responsibilities, outlined treatment protocols. The work was relentless. Dawn to midnight, 7 days a week, moving between patients, adjusting medications, monitoring vital signs, making countless small decisions that collectively determined who would live and who would slip away. The tuberculosis cases responded slowly to antibiotics. Temperatures dropped, coughing diminished, color returned to gray faces. Morrison watched women who had been bedridden sit up, then stand, and walk carefully around the barracks with assistance. The malnutrition cases required delicate management. Too much food too quickly would overwhelm systems that had adapted to starvation, potentially causing cardiac failure. Morrison designed feeding schedules that gradually increased caloric intake, balancing the need for nutrition against the risk of refeeding syndrome. He watched weights climb, 2 pounds, 5 pounds, 10 pounds flesh, slowly covering bones that had protruded like cliff edges. But the pregnant women worried him most. Margot's preeclampsia remained unstable despite medication. The second woman, Helena, showed signs of placental insufficiency, meaning her baby was not receiving adequate nutrition through the umbilical cord. The third, Anna, had developed an infection that threatened both her life and her unborn child's. Morrison consulted with an obstetrician in Austin, a woman named Dr. Patricia O'Brien, who had delivered hundreds of babies in her 40-year career. She arrived at Camp Swift on a Saturday morning, examined the 3 women, and delivered her assessment with characteristic bluntness. The first one needs to deliver within 48 hours, O'Brien said, referring to Margot. The second might make it another week, but I wouldn't bet on it. The third needs immediate surgery to clear that infection. Or should go septic. Can we do the surgeries here? Morrison asked. O'Brien looked around the barracks, the makeshift surgical area Morrison had set up, the sterilized instruments laid out on metal trays, the portable lights rigged for maintenance equipment. It's not ideal, she admitted, but I've delivered babies in stranger places. During the Depression, I once performed an emergency cesarean in the back of a pickup truck. She met Morrison's eyes. If we're doing this, we need to do it now. No more waiting. They operated on Anna first. The infection had spread through her pelvic region, creating abscesses that had to be drained and cleaned. Morrison assisted O'Brien, his hands steady despite the cramped conditions and inadequate lighting. Chon monitored anesthesia, adjusting dosages with careful precision. 2 nurses stood ready with instruments, supplies, blood plasma if needed. The surgery lasted 3 hours. When O'Brien finally stepped back, her scrubs were soaked with sweat despite the cool evening air, but Anna's vital signs were stable and the infection was cleared. One down, O'Brien said. Let's get some rest and tackle the others tomorrow. But Margot's condition deteriorated overnight. Her blood pressure spiked, Her hands and feet swelled with fluid retention, and she began experiencing seizure signs of eclampsia, the potentially fatal progression of preeclampsia. Morrison made the decision at 4 in the morning. Emergency cesarean section performed immediately despite the risks. O'Brien arrived within 30 minutes. They worked by lamplight, Morrison's hands moving through procedures he had only read about in medical textbooks, trusting O'Brien's guidance and his own instincts. The baby came out small and blue, not breathing, and for several terrible seconds, Morrison thought they had lost him. Then Chun suctioned the infant's airways, and a thin wail pierced the barracks. The baby's color shifted from blue to pink, his tiny fists clenching as he drew breath after breath. Margot, still under anesthesia, could not hear her son's first cry, but Morrison saw tears tracking down Chun's face as she wrapped the infant in clean blankets. They named him Thomas, after Morrison's father. It seemed appropriate, somehow a life saved in the place where Morrison had learned the terrible cost of helplessness. Helena delivered 4 days later, naturally, but with complications that required O'Brien's steady expertise. Her daughter arrived small but healthy, with a shock of dark hair and lungs that worked perfectly. Anna, recovering from her surgery, was able to deliver 3 weeks later once the infection had fully cleared. Her son came screaming into the world, angry and vital. By midsummer, the transformation was visible to anyone who entered the barracks. Women who had arrived skeletal now showed the soft curves of proper nutrition. Faces that had been hollow and gray now carried color. The tuberculosis patients were recovering, their lungs clearing, their energy returning. The broken bones had been properly set and splinted. The infections had been cleared. And 3 babies slept in makeshift cribs, watched over by mothers who had been given a chance at survival. The other prisoners noticed. German soldiers in adjacent compounds heard about the American doctor who had broken regulations to save enemy lives. Word spread through the POW network, carried in whispered conversations and smuggled notes. Morrison became something unexpected, a symbol of the strange contradiction that was American power. A nation that could wage total war with industrial efficiency, yet whose doctor would risk court-martial to save the lives of women from the defeated regime. One evening in late August, Morrison sat outside the barracks, watching the Texas sunset paint the horizon in shades of orange and purple. Chun joined him, carrying 2 cups of coffee that had become their evening ritual. 40 women, Chun said quietly, all alive, all recovering. Morrison nodded. The number felt both enormous and impossibly small. 40 lives saved against millions lost. A tiny victory in a war that had consumed continents. Do you ever wonder if it was worth it? Chun asked. Breaking all those rules, risking your career, spending every waking hour fighting regulations and supply chains and military bureaucracy? Morrison thought about Margot, who had asked him if she was dying. He thought about Thomas's first breath, Helena's daughter's fierce cry, Anna's son's vital rage. He thought about the women who could now walk unassisted, who laughed sometimes, who sang German folk songs in the evenings when they thought no one was listening. Every single day, Morrison replied. And every single day, the answer is yes. The war ended in the Pacific in September. Japan surrendered after the deployment of weapons, so devastating that Morrison could barely comprehend. The reports filtering through military channels. The world began the long, painful process of reconstruction, of counting the dead, of figuring out how to build peace from the ashes of total war. The German women were eventually repatriated, sent back to a homeland that no longer existed in the form they remembered. Morrison received letters occasionally, updates about their lives. Margot found her husband alive, reunited with him and Thomas in a displaced persons camp near Hamburg. Helena became a teacher, raising her daughter in a country learning to confront its past. Anna emigrated to Canada with her son, built a new life in a place without the weight of old memories. Morrison stayed in the army for another 5 years, then returned to Oklahoma. He opened a practice in the same rural area where his father had died, treating farmers and ranchers and anyone else who needed care. He never spoke publicly about his time at Camp Swift, never sought recognition or praise for what he had done. But in his office, barely visible unless you knew to look, he kept a photograph. 40 women standing together in the Texas sunlight, their faces showing the first hints of health, their eyes carrying something that might have been hope. 3 babies held in their mother's arms. And in the back corner, barely in frame, Captain James Morrison and Lieutenant Sarah Chun, their white coats bright against the dust-brown landscape. Years later, when historians began documenting the prisoner of war system during the Second World War, they would find Morrison's detailed medical records. They would read his reports, his unauthorized requisitions, his careful documentation of every decision that had violated regulations in service of the oath he had taken. They would note that he had been reprimanded twice, recommended for court-martial once, and ultimately received a commendation from the Surgeon General for exceptional medical service. But the records could not capture what Morrison himself understood, that the 40 lives saved at Camp Swift represented something larger than medical intervention or humanitarian aid. They represented a choice, made by one man in one place at one moment, to prioritize the fundamental obligation of medicine over the convenient classifications of wartime politics. In Germany, they had been workers for the regime, complicit in the machinery of conquest and oppression. In the Atlantic crossing, they had been prisoners, stripped of identity and agency. But in that Texas barracks under Morrison's care, they had become simply what they always were, human beings whose lives mattered, whose suffering demanded response, whose survival was worth fighting for, regardless of uniform or nationality, or the angry denunciations of those who believed mercy had no place in the aftermath of war. The babies grew up. Thomas became an engineer, Helana's daughter a physician, Anna's son a teacher. They lived lives their mothers had nearly lost, raised families of their own, contributed to the slow rebuilding of a shattered world. And though most of them never knew the full story of their births, never understood how close they came to never existing, they carried forward something essential, proof that even in the darkest times, individual choices of compassion could ripple forward through generations. Morrison died in 1983, at age 74, in the same Oklahoma farmhouse where his father had passed decades earlier. His obituary mentioned his military service, his long career in rural medicine, his dedication to his community. It did not mention Camp Swift or the 40 women or the regulations he broke. But at his funeral, 3 old women attended. They had traveled from Germany, from Canada, their faces lined with age, but still recognizable to anyone who had seen that photograph. They stood together at the graveside, said nothing, and placed 40 white roses on the casket before departing. The other mourners did not understand the gesture. Morrison's children asked who the women were, what connection they had to their father. But Morrison's wife, who had heard the story late one night many years earlier, simply smiled and said they were people whose lives her husband had touched. It was, she knew, the most profound understatement she would ever make. In the Texas heat of 1945, Captain James Morrison had seen women dying and made a choice, not because regulations authorized it, not because military policy encouraged it, not because anyone would reward or recognize it, but because he was a doctor, and doctors save lives, and some obligations transcend the temporary classifications of war and peace, victor and defeated, us and them. 40 lives, 3 babies. One man who understood that the measure of civilization is not how we treat our friends in times of peace, but how we treat our enemies in times of crisis. The sun set over Camp Swift that August evening, casting long shadows across the compound. Inside the barracks, women slept peacefully for perhaps the first time since their capture. Babies nursed at their mothers' breasts. And Captain Morrison sat outside, drinking coffee with Lieutenant Chun knowing that he had broken every rule in the book and that he would do it all again without hesitation. Because some things are worth fighting for, especially when no one is watching, no one is keeping score, and history might never remember your name.